Hello everyone, and welcome to our presentation today on the book Magic: 5 Keys to Unlock the Power of Employee Engagement. Today we are celebrating the release of the book, and we set up a panel discussion here about the book and employee engagement, and we're very excited today to have this book finally be released. It's been a long time coming and we put a lot of work into it, so we hope you enjoy what we're going to present to you today. My name is Charles Rogel, and I'm the Director of Products and Marketing here at DecisionWise, and I'll be the moderator for today's presentation. Our panel of presenters includes the co-author of the book, Dr. Tracy Maylett.
Hi, welcome.
Tracy is the CEO and President of DecisionWise, and he holds a doctorate in organization change from Pepperdine University and also an MBA from Brigham Young University. And he works with executive teams from around the world to interpret employee engagement survey results and drive organization performance. Also with us is Daryl Harmon.
Hi there.
Daryl is one of our master trainers for our Engagement Magic training program, which is based on the book. He has over 20 years of experience in consulting, corporate training, and organization development, and he holds a master's in organizational behavior. And our third presenter today is Dr. David Mason.
Hi, everyone.
David's a consultant and trainer here at DecisionWise, and he holds a degree in cognitive psychology from Columbia University, and he's been leading the development of our Engagement Magic training program. Before we begin, there's a few items that I wanted to cover. Number one, this presentation will last for an hour. Everyone's on mute, so if you have questions, please submit them using the question feature on the toolbar. This presentation also qualifies for 1 credit hour toward professional HR recertification for HR certification. And I will be sending out hold on one moment, I have some audio difficulty. I'll be sending out a link to the training program, or to the certification link, or with the code that you can use to obtain your certification information. And after this session, I'll also be sending out an email with additional information from today's presentation. We'll also be choosing 10 lucky winners to receive a free copy of the book today. And so after we sort through all the information, we'll do a random drawing for those 10 lucky winners. So we'll contact you if you do win and get your information so we can mail that to you. Well, Tracy, before we begin, before we get into the whole presentation and describe kind of what the book's about, I first wanted to ask, why did you write Magic? And the reason is because engagement obviously is a hot topic right now. It shows that everyone has their own opinions. But what were you hoping to accomplish by writing the book?
Well, first of all, you mentioned that engagement right now is a very hot topic. It's received a lot of increased attention over the last while. There are a lot of reasons for that. There are obviously reasons as far as profitability in an organization and overall effectiveness. But the concept of engagement isn't clear in most organizations. In other words, it's often confused with terms such as satisfaction, happiness, employee well-being, etc. And that's not what engagement's all about. What we really wanted to do was provide a clear way for companies to create cultures that are engaging cultures, as well as a way for employees to understand how their own levels of engagement are impacted. We also knew that we needed to clear up some myths about what engagement is and what engagement really isn't. So it's really all about clearing up those myths and understanding.
Excellent. And you can see here on the slide all the work that went into creating the book. We did a lot of review of all the literature that's out there. So we've basically read everything that's been written on employee engagement here to put this in the book. But a lot of our research also came from the data that we've mined or collected over the years from companies that we work with to conduct employee engagement surveys. And so from that information, we're able to provide a really clear picture of what's driving engagement in companies, what engagement really is, and then how we can really leverage it to increase our own motivation and commitment at work. And we've also looked at a bunch of business case studies, of which we'll talk about some of them today, but many of those are included in the book as well. For today's agenda, Tracy, there's 3 items that we wanted to cover. Do you want to review those for us?
Yeah, sure. The first one is to really help people understand what are some of these myths and be able to differentiate myth from fact. So one of the things we'll talk about today is what are some of those myths that we see very commonly when we see engagement literature, when we hear about engagement. And we're covering a lot of that in the Magic book as well. The next part we're going to understand is really what are those critical factors most critical to engagement. So sneak peek here. As we've referred to in the past, the word MAGIC is actually an acronym meaning autonomy, growth, impact, and connection. We'll address that in quite a bit of detail on this webinar today. Finally, what we want to do is help organizations and individuals. So this pertains to the overall company, the organization, or whatever, plus the individual employee. That includes everyone on this phone call, on this webinar. Really, what are some of those things that can help us unlock the power of employee engagement? Employee engagement is powerful, and we'll talk a little bit about that today.
So let's begin with addressing some of these myths. On page 15 in the book, in the introduction section, there's a header that says myths versus facts. And you list a couple of different myths that you call scare quotes, one of which we're displaying here on the presentation.
Yeah, I love this one. The reason I like this so much is because we see this as kind of a prelude or a preamble to any engagement article that we see. They're quoting statistics like this. Only 13% of employees worldwide are engaged in their work. Another one that we hear quite commonly is 78% of employees are disengaged in their jobs. Now, one of the reasons why we start off with this is because, well, let's put some common sense into this. As we do employee engagement surveys and we work with people all over the place, one of the things we find very clearly is that most people choose to be engaged. Most people don't want to come to work and say, you know, I just really hope today is a horrible day at work. It just doesn't happen. People really do want to be engaged in their jobs. So to think that 8 out of 9 people would be disengaged in their role just does not make sense. And this is one of the reasons why we really started to research this and find out more about it. So in this webinar, one of the things we're going to be talking about is what really is engagement and what causes that to happen. So first thing we want to start off with is the idea of transformation and transaction. All right, so when we look at an organization is like a bank account. It's like a financial account where you have the company, you have the employee, and you have a balance between what the company and what the employee puts in. So a transactional environment or transactional company is one where the employee puts in a certain amount of effort for whatever the company has put into that account. Once that company becomes overdrawn on that account by asking employees to do certain things, or the employee doesn't feel like he or she is being treated at a level commensurate with what he or she is getting out of that company becomes overdrawn. Same thing happens with an employee. And what you tend to start having is kind of a negotiation process where the company says, if you do this, then I'll do this. And the employee says, if you do this, then I will do this. And it's really a transactional environment. It's a this for that environment. Now, while those environments are very, very common, one of the problems is that's a dangerous environment. That's not an engaged environment. It's a transactional environment. And once either the employee or company becomes overdrawn, even for a short period of time, that employee or the company also checks out on the other side as well. So what we really want to address is the difference between engagement and a transaction or satisfaction environment. And Dr. Mason, I'm going to ask you to start off on this one. The idea of perks. You know, one of the things that we see quite often is organizations saying, you know, what we need to do is we need to throw more at the equation. Let's get a foosball table. Let's get Taco Tuesdays. Let's throwing perks at the issue. You want to address that for just a minute? It's a key point of magic.
Oh yeah, it's fantastic. It goes exactly with what you're saying about this transaction, this bank account. If I'm a company and this is the way I'm thinking, okay, well, if I want my employees to work harder, what I need to do is I need to tip the scales in my favor. And so what I do is I start throwing more stuff at them so that the scales tip, and that they go, oh, well, look at all this stuff the company gave me. I need to work harder in order to do that.
So they're putting more into the transactional bank account,
exactly.
Right? Okay.
And that makes so much sense, and so many people do it. And that's why I want to explore this a little bit, is so we can see what happens when you do that. So you look at a lot of companies, and this is one of the things I love to do in training, say, okay, talk to me about your perks. What do you get? What are some of the best perks you've ever heard? And we have things all the time, like, you know, we have our Taco Tuesday, our Margarita Monday, Casual Friday. Then they start getting into, oh, here's perks I've heard of. They walk my dog, they buy my groceries. And now I'm essentially talking about Google at this point, but, you know, we have nap pods, we have on-site gyms, haircuts, anything. Because the idea is, oh, if I can give these more things, then the employees more things, then they're going to be happier. They're going to put more effort in, things like that. Now, here's the problem with that. If you remember, and I'm going to make you all go way back to your driving test at this point, what's one of the things they tell you about transitioning from a freeway onto regular streets? They say you have to be really careful because you got used to driving at 75 miles an hour, 65 miles, 55 if you're,
80 here in Utah.
80 in Utah. You're driving really fast, and then suddenly you go onto a surface street, and you've gotten really adapted to that speed, and suddenly you're driving a little faster than you should be. This is something that's so natural with humans, is that we are incredibly adept at adapting. So anything that you do, you're going to become used to it. So Tracy, this might be a good time to ask. I think I deserve a raise. So you give me you give me this raise.
We'll
right?
continue this webinar with 3 hosts. Exactly. Good point. Good point.
Right. So you give me a raise, and I'm fantastic. I'm so pumped. How long does that last? Well, it's going to depend on the person, but it's not long. A year from now, I'm not going to be giving you that discretionary effort because you gave me a raise last year. I will have adapted to it. I will have started spending it more on comic books or vacations or anything. And suddenly I'm like, Tracy, I'm going to need another raise. And so it goes on, so on and so on. If I get used to something like Taco Tuesday, pretty soon I'm like, oh, well, I've got Taco Tuesday, but this company down here has Margarita Monday. Now I'm going to want that as well. Now I'm going to want more. The adaptation principle shows why this transactional environment will not work to create engagement.
Okay, so similar to a bank account, that transaction, the more I put in, the more I'm also expecting out of this. And it works both ways. But at a certain point, we reach a point of satiation or saturation to where we say, I'm used to this, and now my level's been raised. And that's what happens in a transactional environment. That's one of the reasons why these are so dangerous. Like you say, now I get Margarita Monday and Fajita Friday down the road. Well, I'll leave for that because of that case.
Well, now, and here's the other kicker. What happens if something changes and you need to take that away? Like, people aren't going, oh, well, I'm back to where I was before, no Taco Tuesday. No, people are ticked because they got so used to that's standard, that's basic, that's status quo, and you take away that perk, well, you just found out how disengaged you can make employees by doing that.
Good. So that's one of our first messages, is that perks don't buy engagement. And so many organizations are spending money on trying to create an engaged culture by buying perks. Perks do not create engagement. That's one of the first messages I hope people will take out of Magic. It's a very expensive process as well.
Yeah.
Let's talk really about what employee engagement is. So David, you asked this question a lot, and Daryl, you asked this in your training sessions. What does a good day at work look like for you? What are some of the responses that you hear?
Yeah, so this is kind of the quick and dirty introduction to engagement, where we ask people, just check yourself. What does a good day at work look like for you? And the kind of responses that we get are things like, I was able to accomplish something meaningful. I felt strong. I was able to use my talents. I felt stretched. I learned something new. I was able to solve a problem or deliver a product, for a customer, for a client. Or I really enjoy the people I work with. These are things that aren't satisfiers. These are things that aren't perks. In fact, we don't hear things, of course, at the other end of the spectrum of, I'm really glad I didn't get shot or bitten by a spider. Or even things like I had a great cup of hot chocolate, or I had a really refreshing nap in my nap pod. We don't hear things like that, because what you and I want when we go to work is, of course, we've got to have a certain amount of things that keep us safe, to keep us satisfied, but those aren't the things that engage us. What really engages are the things that make us feel glad that we went to work. So those are the kinds of things that we hear.
So let's really talk about what is employee engagement. So there's a difference between, we started off this webinar by talking about one of the things, the myths that we are trying to clear up, is that engagement is not equal to satisfaction. It's not equal to happiness. Those may be outcomes or some of the factors that result in that, but really, what is employee engagement? So let's talk about the definition of employee engagement. For us, now, we've seen a lot of great definitions that are out there. For purposes of this webinar and for purposes of the book, we say employee engagement is an emotional state where we feel passionate, energetic, and committed toward our work. In turn, we fully invest our best selves, our hearts, spirits, minds, and hands in the work that we do. Now, with employee engagement, it's important to note that it's a two-part equation here. One of the things we'll talk about in just a minute is who actually owns employee engagement. Now, when we talk about a two-part equation, there are a couple of areas that we want to address. First of all, hearts, spirits, minds, and hands. Let's just talk about that for just a minute. You'll notice that when we talk about two parts, part of it is feeling, part of it is actually doing. So the first part of this, with regards to heart, what we're talking about is an employee who is willing to dedicate his or her passion to what they're doing, the desire, the feeling, the love for their particular job. The next one is spirit. So next one down, spirit really is about the passion that's there. It's about the energy that exists. So while the heart is about the love for the job, the passion there, spirit is where you actually feel that. Spirit is where the energy is in the room. If we talk about going into a basketball game or a soccer game or whatever that may be, and you feel a team spirit, Spirit is that energy that exists between the players and the individuals. Their mind is devoting my thoughts to what I do, and then the hand is the actual doing piece of this. So we have both the feeling and the doing components of magic here. So both of those are, both elements of those are extremely important in engaged cultures.
Now, as we're looking at our research, we're pulling this data now from our Employee Engagement Survey benchmark database. And so what we find is that the majority of the people in the organization are engaged. Either they're fully engaged or sometimes engaged is kind of how we classify them. And a lot of times people in that sometimes engaged category gravitate or maybe change from being fully engaged to sometimes engaged.
So Charles, this idea of 8 out of 9 employees being disengaged in their job, our 14 million responses don't support that.
Yeah, we don't see that at all. In fact, you know, so this supports what we know anecdotally, that most people in an organization are there to work hard and do a good job and want to be engaged, and there's very few people that don't. Now, we have this group, the 24% that we call waiting to be engaged. These are those that are responding, you know, less positively to these overall questions about engagement. But still, they're not fully disengaged like we find in only 4% of the people in the organization.
And the key here is that what's interesting is it doesn't mean, first of all, our fully engaged folks, those 23%, are those folks that you have the hearts, the minds, the hands, the spirit involved in what they do. Most of us, half of the population fits into that sometimes engaged group, meaning that we will engage given the right opportunity. So it doesn't mean we're always engaged 100% of the time. There are things about my own job, speaking personally, that I just don't enjoy. Now, but the reason I do those is because they allow me to do something that I do enjoy, and we all have those pieces in our jobs. Yeah?
That's right.
Now, it's those 4% down at the bottom that are very unlikely to engage in anything they do. In fact, as we see what happens to those people year over year, they simply don't ever engage. These are the people that we track, and what happens is they either leave the organization or they mentally quit and basically don't do anything and even sabotage the organization. That waiting to be engaged group's an interesting one, because often these were people who were previously very engaged in what they did, but for some reason they're missing some of those elements of magic. That's what we'll talk about today.
In fact, we like to also call them the opportunity.
The opportunity group,
because
right?
That's the greatest. You're going to find the greatest value and investment right there.
So let's transition here and talk about this model of engagement that we uncovered from all the research.
First of all, the base here is satisfaction. The idea that there are certain things that do need to be in place in order for me to be satisfied with my job. Satisfaction doesn't cause me to go above and beyond. I am just that. I'm satisfied. Those things include I need to have the appropriate pay. I need to have the tools that I need to do my job. I need to be able to be trained, and so I have the resources to make it happen. I need to work in a safe environment. These are satisfaction things. These are elements that don't necessarily engage me, but the lack thereof will cause me to be very disengaged. Those need to be the base of what we do. Then we move to the level of engagement. Engagement is where we dedicate our hearts, spirits, minds, and hands. And we use an acronym, and this is the basis of the book, MAGIC. MAGIC stands for meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, and connection. And before we go into much of this, it's important to note that all these factors do not have to be 100% present at all times in order for me to be engaged. However, the more that these factors are inherent in my job or the place where I work, the environment, that I'm much more likely to be engaged in what I do. That's why we focus in this book on meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, and connection. So I'd like to start with the first one. The first one being meaning. And Dave, I'm going to ask you to address this a little bit. What do you see as meaning? What do you find as you're working in the team in the research here?
Well, it's really an interesting subject because there's a lot of research, but there's also a lot of just passion and feeling towards it. And so this is one of my favorite sections to do training on, because you get these wonderful stories of people that have found purpose that goes beyond the job themselves. And sometimes it's in places that you wouldn't necessarily think. If I could tell a quick story, there's one, and this is a perfect slide because it actually has to do with food services. Tracy, do you remember the time we were doing a training to about 300 people at this large healthcare organization, and we asked them the question about meaningful jobs. And this one table talked about how, oh, you know what, that's all well and good for some of the people that have the very...
Yeah, the nurses, the physicians, they're taking care of patients all day,
right?
Changing lives, right.
And this person said, you know what, my job's not terribly meaningful. I work in the cafeteria, I prepare food, and that's it. And then someone else raised their hand and she was just a dynamo. She stood up and she said, you know, I also work in the food industry, but I tend to disagree. I look at my job as being one of the key contributor jobs of this organization. When people come to a hospital, it's not generally for something good. It's generally sometimes the worst time of their life. They're going through something terrible. And my job is when these people have been sitting in a hospital bed for days, people are coming to visit them, they've just heard bad news. There's one thing that can cheer them up sometimes, and that's just having a good hot meal. And so I pour everything I can into making sure that that food heals their soul and gives them at least one bright spot in what might otherwise be an awful time in their lives. And people just, it was pretty incredible. 300 people stood up and applauded this lady.
It was great to see. So a lot of it is not necessarily, part of it is the job, part of it is what we find in the job. Well, let's talk a little bit about mission statements here for just a second, what the organization actually does and how I find meaning in what I do. This is an actual mission statement. In fact, Charles was mentioning a little bit earlier today that he actually Googled this to see a little bit more about it and found, what did you find?
At least on the first page, there were 5 companies using this exact same mission statement word for word in their shareholder financial statement.
So let me read it in the most monotone voice I possibly can. Well, I'll add a little life to it.
Sure.
The company's primary objective is to maximize long-term stockholder value while adhering to laws of the jurisdiction in which it operates and at all times observing the highest ethical standards. Come on, did we basically just say that what we're trying to do is stay out of jail while making money? Is that really what it's all about?
Much.
That's not a very motivating or engaging mission statement. Yet we find that quite often. Now, this isn't about mission statements, but let's look at a couple more, and we'll tie this in.
Yeah, it makes me feel like I'm working for the man.
It really does, doesn't it? So what kind of meaning would you find in your job? Now, this is one that's interesting. Starbucks, our mission, to inspire and nurture the human spirit. One person, one cup, and one neighborhood at a time. Let's look at another one. This is Patagonia. Build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, use business to inspire, and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. Now, when we talk about, and Daryl will talk a little bit later about connecting to an organization and the vision of the organization, but in order for me to find meaning in my work, I have to be able to understand that I'm part of something greater. There's a reason why I'm doing this, and the reason is something that's very important. Once we can make that connection, we find meaning in our jobs. But meaning does not necessarily have to be, well, Dave, you want to explain this, the idea of inherent and associated meaning?
Yeah, so with meaning, the way we talk about it a lot of times is that, well, going back to the thing earlier with the lunch lady, where it's so easy to say, oh, some jobs have just meaning built into them. Right. Doctors, nurse, policeman, firefighter, teacher.
Because it's natural in the job. It's inherent in the job that I do. I'm taking care of the individual, right?
And what's happening here is that's because the values of that job, very similarly expressed by those mission statements, are the kind of values that we tend to all, as a people, value. Educating youth, helping those in need, and so on. Sometimes jobs don't have that naturally built in, but that doesn't mean you can still not find meaning. And this is where we try and distinguish between inherent and associated meaning, because the key is to find your values, your personal mission statement, and then see where your values align with the meaning. And so your associated meaning, you might not like your job as a telemarketer or as an encyclopedia salesman or something like that. But you know what you can find meaning in? You might find meaning in the idea that, hey, you know what? I'm providing for my children so they can go to college. I'm the first person to be able to support adoption in my family or something like that. There's so many different ways to find meaning that are not necessarily just inherent in the job themselves.
And it doesn't necessarily just have to be the whole job. So, for example, there are pieces I mentioned in my job that I don't enjoy. I travel a lot for my job. And when I get to the end result and I'm able to meet with the client and the organization and see the change that takes place, I get excited about that. But hopping on an airplane and being on that plane for 2.5 hours does not excite me. So the elements in that job that don't provide meaning for me are the travel piece. But I also realize at the same time it allows me to do something. So I'm associating this with something that allows me to do that does have meaning for me.
And I think the key take-home point here is that you will never find any task that you do that is devoid of meaning. And that's one of the things the book makes very clear. And it actually gives you ways to find that in yourself. Like there's a number of questions you can ask yourself on, okay, well, where do my values align? How can I redefine this task into a more meaningful one?
Very good. Let's move on to the next one. Let's address autonomy. Autonomy is the power to shape your work and environment in ways that allow you to perform at your best. Now, Daryl, are we talking about complete anarchy here?
Not exactly. No. In fact, my favorite example here, if we've been talking about physicians, my favorite example that we sometimes use is a doctor. If you think about doctors, you think, well, they're at the top of the food chain. They can do pretty much whatever they want. They went to school all those years. They're in a power position. But if you think about an ER physician, this isn't somebody who says, you know, I think today I'm going to have people come to me at my house, and that's my autonomous choice. No, if you think of an ER physician, this is someone who has to be at a certain place at a certain time. Now, there may be autonomy around how that person performs a job, but anyway, there are bounds to autonomy.
Let's talk about a couple of organizations here, a difference between an organization that has a level of autonomy and one that maybe does not as much. Let's talk about Walmart, first of all. Walmart showed same-store sales growth of about 2% over the last few years, and that's very well publicized. Walmart also has a lot of criticism for notoriously low wages. They even asked last year and the year before for employees to donate food to coworkers during the holidays to be able to help support them. Walmart is a company that's known for being fairly policy heavy. And one of the things that we saw last year during the holiday season was in 2013, there were widespread strikes. So the intent here is not a Walmart bash by any stretch. But what it is to talk a little bit about what the difference an autonomous organization is able to create. Let's look at a counterpart, Costco. Well, Costco had the same store sales growth of about 5%. And what's interesting is they still charge members a $55 fee. So members are still willing to pay for the privilege of going to ShopCo. Now, what's some of the difference? Well, there's a lot of logistical and operational differences, but let's talk about some people differences. First of all, store manager, the warehouse manager within Costco has complete power to hire, fire, and do a lot of things with very little corporate influence or interference. In fact, their policy manual is written by the employees. There are groups that get together and rewrite the policy manual on a regular basis, rewritten by employees rather than coming down from the organization. Now, one of the reasons why we put this is essentially they're basically in the same type of business, but notice the difference in terms of profitability and the way some of these are handled. A lot of this boils down to simply employees and the stores have more autonomy. When we're talking about autonomy, we're talking about 4 different kinds here. In the book, we illustrate that there are really 4 types. First one is spatial autonomy. That's the ability to decide or determine where I'm going to work. So what does my workspace look like? What location is that? Do I work from home? What does my cubicle look like? The next one is temporal. That's deciding when. When do I work? If it's important to me to be home, for my children to be home, when they get out of school at 3 o'clock, well, that's important. That's temporal autonomy. Social autonomy is the ability to determine with whom you're going to work. So that my coworkers, I work with people I enjoy, and Daryl will talk about that more in the connection piece. And finally, task autonomy, the ability to decide how best to do my task. Now, notice that most jobs do not have all of these 100% of the time. So Charles, you can spill your dirty laundry here. Do you have all of those 100% of the time in your job?
No, not quite. Temporal, I need to be here certain hours of the week. Spatial, I have to be here at work most of the time, although there's a little flexibility in terms of maybe working from home once in a while.
You know, it's interesting that a lot of us have different preferences. So for me, maybe I would have to say task autonomy is most important, the ability to decide how I do this. For others, it may be temporal autonomy. I pick up my kids at 3:30, therefore it's important to me to have that temporal autonomy. But the more level of autonomy that we can have in our job, the more important that is. David, you and I had a conversation the other day about a lot of times the problem is people just don't test their autonomy, don't realize they have a certain level of autonomy.
Oh, absolutely, and that's one of the biggest things we try and help people realize is their own potential for that. Because if you think about it, how much autonomy do you actually have in your life, right? It's, for example, at any company you go to, they don't make you change your name. They might make you wear a uniform, but there's still some autonomy in exactly how you do that. They don't say like what color your hair is or how you have to look. Like, there's actually, when you think about it, very few things that they actually restrict you on. And so when you start thinking about it in terms of how much autonomy do I really have, you go, oh, well, you know, maybe I could do this or could do that. And really anything that helps you recognize your persona as an agentic being, someone who can act rather than be acted upon, is going to increase your engagement.
So we look at the manager's responsibility in this. We often find that managers, leaders in organizations, are so set on the boundaries. They establish these boundaries, and that's okay. We have to set up boundaries in order to establish a level of autonomy. So we can't just have a free-for-all.
Absolutely.
At the same time, one of the things that managers may be too caught up on is what really is within that boundary. In other words, yeah, these are my have-to-haves. We have to have this. We have to have this emergency room physician here from 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. They just have to be here. Now, within that, however, let's talk about some ways, what autonomous pieces that individual can have. Okay, so there's some things that we need to understand with autonomy and really what that means to an individual and an organization. I'd love to move into growth here. This is one that, as we look at our survey results, and again, we pulled up about 14 million last year, this seemed to be the lowest scoring element of all the 5 elements.
Almost across the board.
All across
Anyone
the
we
board.
talk to.
Now, keep in mind that this was in 70 countries. So this was not just a small group based in the western United States. This was kind of all over the world that there was a dearth in growth opportunities.
Right, and what's interesting about that is a lot of times growth just takes a little bit of reframing. When we talk about growth, we're talking about your personal improvement. And a lot of times people just automatically assume, oh, well, promotions. You know, someone has to die before I can be promoted, you know what I mean? And that's very, very common. But that's not what we need, because a lot of times you can promote someone and they don't feel any better. In fact, a lot of times they feel worse because now they've got different responsibilities instead of the stuff that was meaningful to them. Instead of doing what they love to do, now they're managing other people doing what they wanted to do. And so we like to make sure, number one, that you think of growth as this way of your personal development, your progress, and that's also in a professional sense. So if we can, one of the things that we use to help you realize that is what we call the zone of, well, everyone calls it the zone of proximal development. It's from education. We co-opted it to use it in the business field. And the idea is that with growth, there's always going to be a step further. If you spend too long at one area, this is the area that we call a line, where you are perfectly engaged, where you can do everything you need to do. If you spend too long in that area, what happens? You adapt. You get used to it. Eventually you become so good at it, it becomes too easy. You stagnate, and when you stagnate, you actually regress. And no one likes to do a job that's too easy. We often talk, one of the things we ask people is, how much would it take for you to do a job that was just, I don't know, moving widgets from point A to point B and then moving it back? And you never get people that would do it for less than 6 figures, and even then they say they'd want to quit within a year. People want to be stretched. They want to grow.
And you know what's funny about this is a lot of times you'll ask somebody, well, you got a new job, tell me about it. Oh, yeah, it's great. It's really easy. I don't have to do much. And that lasts,
how long does that last, right?
About 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Because people do want to grow. Otherwise it's stagnation. It really
Yes.
is.
So, and then you ask them in 2 weeks, and that job that was too easy is really good. Suddenly becomes, this job is so boring, I hate my life. And so what we talk about then is, okay, well, give them growth opportunities. Now, that doesn't just mean throw the bus at them, because suddenly they're overwhelmed. That's too hard. They're going to burn out. No one wants that. So the key then is to find that zone of proximal development, that very next step to help them grow somewhere. And then you scaffold them from there, and then a little bit farther and a little bit farther. And when they're in that, we call that, when someone's in that position where it's a little bit harder, they're a little out of their comfort zone, but they're still having fun doing it, that engaged kind of thing, that's when you have eustress, that positive stress that helps you perform better. And when you feel that, you love it.
Now, we're not talking about moving into the too hard category.
Oh, no, then you have distress.
Right.
And that actually starts just cankering you because you become overwhelmed and frustrated and everything. That's an awful place to be.
Now, who is it that decides when someone moves into the zone of proximal development? Whose responsibility is that? Is that mine as an employee, or is that my manager's responsibility to push?
Well, that's really, it's a 50-50 proposition, because the employee is going to kind of have to know and feel about where they're comfortable. But the key is they're not going to be able to grow without that help. The manager has to be able to help them along, to mentor them, because otherwise, if they can do it by themselves, well then, heck, you should have done it already. You know what I mean?
That's a great, important point to bring up. When we talk about engagement, one of the basic concepts of the book is that it's a 50-50 proposition, meaning that the organization does own part of the engagement equation. But the individual also owns part of that equation as well. And what we're seeing right now, one of the reasons why engagement had a bad taste 5 years ago or so, because was what it was, the literature and the training programs and things that were involved in engagement all pointed at the organization and said, organization, you need to fix this. You need to make it happen. Same thing with perks. Whose responsibility is it for perks? It's the organization. So it's important to understand that this is a 50-50 equation. When we talk about growth, one of the things we're seeing in organizations is that a lot of times the employee sits back and waits for it to happen. Daryl, you've been in a lot of organizations, been doing a lot of training, and what are some of the things that you see related to this when you get into an organization, you're doing a training program? What are the individuals telling you? About growth. Whose responsibility is that growth?
Well, I don't know if people say exactly whose responsibility, but I will tell you that what I found universally in my career is that people appreciate very much the organization taking an active role in that, because people will do it on their own. And so again, we see that 50-50 played out. We're just calling it out here, saying that you actually can, I mean, it happens naturally, but there's some steps you can actually take to engender that.
Perfect, thank you. You know, one of the things that's interesting as I sit in some of these training sessions is I hear the individual say, oh, this is great, my manager needs to be here. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really. Well, let's move on. Let's talk about the next one. This is the I, this is impact. Impact is seeing positive and worthwhile outcomes and results for your work. So this is the opposite of this, is kind of the hamster on the treadmill, on the mill here, where they're moving back and forth and not getting anything done. Look, just throw out a case study here. One of them is JCPenney. Now, JCPenney's been going through a lot over the last decade. A number of years ago, a few years ago, they hired a CEO, Ron Johnson. One of the first things he did was kill off this culture of the sale and coupon concept. So if you were to go into JCPenney 3 years ago, 5 years ago, what you'd see all over the place is clearance sale, 50%, 30%, buy one, get another one for $10, $10 off your next purchase. This was the culture that was created, and employees over a period of time got very used to this. Then what happened when Johnson stepped in was that he abolished this culture and said, let's get rid of this sale and coupon culture. What we're going to do is we're going to raise and lower prices. And we're going to do this on a regular basis. So these employees, instead of working with the customers, one of their responsibilities was to continually raise and lower the prices. So keep track of the signage, stuff like this. What was interesting from that was not only was that bad in the minds of the employees, and so that's where the literature will focus. You read an article about what JCPenney did, and it'll focus on the customers. But one of the reasons why this failed so obviously and so poorly was because employees were confused. They saw this as an inefficient waste of their time. So what would happen is they were asked to change signs and raise and lower prices. They felt like what they were doing didn't add any value whatsoever. So finally they just gave up and went back to the old culture. So here you have this from the corporate entity saying we're going to be this culture. The employees are saying this is confusing, it's not adding any value, and they went back to the old culture. You're having a cultural shift here and a cultural issue.
Yeah, and employees had to deal with all the complaints from customers too, who were used to or liked the old way of pricing, and
Absolutely.
the new pricing just didn't sit well with
The
them.
employees felt like they were useless, basically. They couldn't change anything.
Couldn't help the customer
Couldn't
anymore.
help the customer, and all they were doing is changing signs. So there's a good example of how that impacted the bottom line of the organization. Now, you're seeing that go back now. When we look at impact, we put this on a 2x2 matrix. So with the bottom of that being effort, the side being impact. So if I put in a low amount of effort and a low amount of impact, I'm apathetic about it. I'm just kind of, I could care less really. It doesn't require a lot of my effort, and I'm not getting any results out of it, so I'm apathetic. The next level is when I put in a lot of effort, but I'm not seeing results. This is when burnout happens. As David would mention a little bit earlier, with regard to burnout, this is where it becomes very, very stressful. So I'm being stretched too much, but I'm not seeing any results.
And there's only so long you can last in that.
Exactly right. The next one is when I put in a low amount of effort, but I see high impact. In other words, it doesn't take me a whole lot to do this, but as I do it, I'm seeing big results. Well, we would think this would be a great place to be, right? Let me give you an example. So when I drive home from work sometimes, and this is dangerous for me, I've been trying to stop this. I drive home and I realize that I've gotten to my exit on that freeway, and I don't remember how I've gotten there. In other words, I'm kind of on autopilot. It's a no-brainer for me. I just drive and I'm there, and hopefully I'm safe as I'm doing that as well. But I get the end results. Now, the problem with this is that when we're on autopilot too long, we don't reach that zone of proximal development that David was talking about a little bit earlier.
Yeah, if you think about it, like think of back in the old day when people were moving west and going 10 miles in 10 minutes would have been unheard of, and they would have loved it and stuff like that. And now it's like, we're doing these crazy things. Louis C.K. has this whole idea about what you complain about air travel and stuff like that. He's like, oh, I'm sorry that you're complaining while you sit in a chair in a flying box in the sky. Like, we just don't care about these things that are so amazing. They don't engage us because we aren't involved. There's no effort on our part. It might as well happen without us.
Exactly right. And even though we're getting results, so the organization says, fantastic, we're getting the results. For the individual, not seeing that level of impact just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Exactly.
The final one is where engagement really occurs. This is when, yes, it does require high effort on my part. I'm stretched, but I also see the impact of what happens. I'm seeing the end result of what I do.
And you care about that impact. It's something that you believe in. The JCPenney's people wanted to help their customers. They wanted to see the best. When they weren't able to do that, they weren't happy.
Exactly right. Daryl, you're very involved in a lot of organizations, and I know we've had conversations about the level of connection that exists. Do you mind just talking about this key to engagement?
Absolutely. And this is going back to something you mentioned earlier, Tracy, about the heart and spirit. This is where we really engage the heart and spirit. And if you think about connection, well, there's several aspects to this, but overall, if you think about we as human beings and our needs to connect, I was kind of thinking of the opposite. If you think about the worst punishment you can inflict on somebody in prison, what is it? It's isolation,
yeah.
right? You take them away from anybody else. Now, we do that probably for legitimate reasons, but it's not only safety for the other prisoners, but it's really a harsh kind of punishment. So that's obviously not where we want to go. So there are 5 kinds of connection, or 5 different ways in which we can connect to our work. And of course, the more the better, but we don't necessarily have to be 100% all the time, as Tracy mentioned earlier. But very briefly, here are the 5 kinds. First of all, social. Again, we as people like to connect with the people we're working around. We like to like the people we're working around. We kind of need that. And so there's a social connection that we might feel.
Daryl, one of the things that I heard in terms of definition of life is that it's interaction with your environment. And once that interaction stops, then we're no longer alive. That happens figuratively in organizations, socially, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it can happen socially, emotionally. It can also happen, we were talking about growth, it can happen intellectually if I'm not feeling connected. So there are lots of connections on connection. The other, another kind of connection is organizationally. Do I feel like I belong here? Do I feel like, this is a place I want to work? I feel valued for what I do. If you think about people who are Disney cast members, I have a daughter who worked for Disney World for a few months as a college student. And if you know something about behind the scenes, Disney puts out an outstanding product, obviously. On the other hand, they're doing that with people who don't make a lot of money. They don't get rich, but they're so engaged. They love the organization. They love being around other people. There's a lot of connection socially, organizationally. And then, excuse me, the third is mission. Do I care what we're about? Again, Disney is a great example of that. We're providing happy moments for families, for little kids. And Steve Jobs, his mission, as it were, was put a ding in the universe. I mean, that's pretty inspiring. I could, get on board with that. Not that I'm going to leave and go to Apple.
So if I can get behind this, the idea that, hey, I want to make a ding in the universe.
Yeah, so I can connect to the mission of the organization. Right? So the organization, do I feel comfortable there, but do I feel comfortable with what we're doing? And then that also leads into values as well. Do I resonate with the values of the organization? If it's innovation, or if it's stability, if it's quality, is it customer service?
Go back to Patagonia's mission statement. We want to be very careful with the environment.
Absolutely.
Sure. Is this an organization that supports families? Is this an organization that believes in certain rights for individuals?
So there are a lot of ways that we can either resonate or not resonate with the values of the organization. And that's another point on which we can connect. And the last one then is task. Do I enjoy what I'm actually doing? Do I love writing code? Do I love training people? Do I love creating beautiful things that people wear or eat or whatever? That's another kind of connection, is task.
I look at task connection, and it's more about your career. Like it defines almost who you are. You are
Right.
part of that task that you're doing, whether you're an electrician or some other type of job. But you also connect in all these other ways to the company that you're with, the people that you work for, and the job that you're doing.
Right, right. Yeah, in fact, that's a great segue into the next aspect of connection, which is not only how we connect, but how deeply we connect. And so there are three kind of levels, if you will, of connection. And the first one is, do I fit here? Do I belong in the organization? Did they hire me to do a job that I feel good at? And that's the basics. Now, over time, we hope that these levels of connection deepen, broaden, etc. So the next level then of connection is, do I feel like I really belong? This is home to me. This is my home away from home here at work because I'm connecting on more levels. I'm connecting with my coworkers, with the work I'm doing, with the mission, the values of the organization.
So where fit may be a round peg in a square hole,
Right.
Deal, right? Where belonging is more, no, this is a piece of, I actually not just fit into this puzzle, but I'm part of this puzzle.
Yeah, I belong here. Yeah.
Feels right. It's home.
Yep. And then finally, I really integrate, or I really start to get part of my identity from the organization, from the work, from all these other aspects, all these other ways in which I connect. Do I really feel integrated? This starts to become part of my identity.
Well, and in fact, so much so that you stop saying I or the company, and you start saying we. We are doing this. This is the product we put out.
Yeah, that's a great indicator. You know, listen to how people talk. Do they talk about me and I, or do they talk about, you know, us versus them kind of mentality? So those are the different ways we can connect. Those are the different levels we can connect. And you can think of the opposite. So think if you had to leave the organization, how much stress would that cause you? Would you be happy to leave, or would you be devastated that you had to leave because you're so integrated?
Very good. Now, as we've gone through each one of these components, meaning autonomy, growth, impact, and connection, I want to impress a couple things on your mind. First one is that 50-50 proposition. The 50-50 proposition is really that I need to, as an individual, put forth my effort. One of the things that we're saying is that, you know, this idea of 8 out of 9 people being disengaged in their jobs, does that really make sense? Can you look around and look at 9 people that you work with, a group of 9, and say 8 of those people are disengaged? It doesn't make sense. Everyone wants to be engaged in what they do. So there's one piece that we need to understand. Engagement is a 50-50 proposition. The next one is that magic, our keys to creating that environment in which we can choose to be engaged. Ultimately, engagement is a choice, and it's the individual's choice. The individual has to choose to be engaged. And everyone can be engaged in what they do. Those magic elements, meaning autonomy, growth, impact, and connection, are keys to making that happen. What's interesting about it is everyone wants to be engaged. Everyone can be engaged. They just need the right place to make it happen. And engagement is truly a choice. So as we go through here, one of the things that I hope also comes out of here is the idea that even people who may appear to be disengaged in what they do can actually engage in the right environment. It's up to the individual. The manager can create an environment in which they can choose to be engaged. In fact, the book gives, there's an entire chapter written specifically to managers on how to create that engaging environment, including how to have an engagement interview, how to implement these 5 elements, and so forth.
Well, thanks, Tracy, Daryl, and David. I wanted to, before we close, we have a few moments for questions here. So if you have questions, please submit them using the question toolbar on the GoToWebinar application. But I have a few things that I'll be sending to you in my email that I wanted to let you know about.
Oh, and this one's really cool.
Yeah. First of all, go on and evaluate or measure your own level of engagement and find out your the level or discover the level of meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, and connection that you have in your job. We've developed an online free self-assessment. We call it our Engagement Magic Self-Assessment. You can see the URL here at the bottom of the slide, and I'll send you an email with more information. But feel free to go ahead and take it as many times as you want, share it with anyone that you want. It gives you a really neat printout and report that shows you your results and the different levels of engagement that you're experiencing compared to the 5 keys to employee engagement. So I want to encourage you to do that. If you'd like to order the book, it's available online now at Amazon.com.
Starting today. Today's a big day for us.
Yes, it's released, and so you can order it and they'll ship it to you. Or it's available on the bookshelves in bookstores all around the country and airports, wherever you go. So be on the lookout for it, and feel free to pick one up wherever you prefer to purchase books. And then lastly, if you're interested in more information on the training program we've developed around this concept, you can visit our website engagementmagic.com. I'll also send out a link with more information there. And you can find out how to attend an open enrollment workshop or bring the training into your organization. We do have a few questions. One that came in earlier was regarding this concept of connection and the relationship that an employee has with a manager, and how that best works. I guess when we're talking about connection, do we really need to be connected in a good relationship with our manager, and how does that relationship look? We don't want to cross boundaries and that sort of thing.
Right. I mean, something that's thrown around a lot, and I tend to believe it. I hear a lot of people say this, that Gallup first said this, that people join organizations but they leave managers. And that just reveals how important that relationship is. It will vary, again, depending on the other elements. So autonomy, for example, if you work very closely with your manager, then that relationship is going to be more important.
Mm-hmm.
If you're more autonomous and work more independently, that's going to be a little less. And so there's some nuances there, but it's obviously one of the most important relationships we have at work.
Now, on the opposite side of that also, some people would say, it doesn't really matter to me.
Mm-hmm.
You could be a programmer, developer, writing code and say, I'm not in it for the relationship with my manager, my coworkers. I'm in it because this code is cool.
Right. And it really depends on the nature of that interaction. Because, with some people, they'll depend more on their manager for direction. Others will say, leave me alone, give me direction overall, strategic direction, and then let me do my thing. So it has a lot to do with the nature of the relationship as well.
A quick question here. Is the book available on audio yet? Not currently, although we're trying to convince Tracy to record the book himself now.
It is available. James Earl Jones not available.
Right.
It is available through ebook, though, so you can download a copy for a Kindle or whatever you like.
Now, one other question that came in is really pertinent, and that is, what are some of the interventions that we recommend to help boost engagement, either organizationally or personally? In the book, we list, it seems like after every concept, there's about 20 recommendations or interventions that we recommend after each chapter. What are some of the more common ones that you'd recommend?
Well, first of all, Charles, as you mentioned, the book does give a lot of suggestions. So it gives a bunch of different suggestions about how do I find my own levels of engagement, that kind of thing. One thing certainly is to hop online and take your self-assessment, see how engaged you are. But one of the key areas that touches on a couple of questions that were just asked is that we also provide in this book some engagement interviews, some questions that a manager can sit down and ask his or her individual employees. They're excellent questions, just to be able to sit down as an intervention, or not an intervention, it's preventative, sit down with an employee and just ask the questions. Tell me, where do you really find meaning in your job? What appeals to you about it? And those type of interviews are just so incredible. Each one of the chapters lists anywhere from 5 to 10 of these questions.
Yeah, for example, I was going to read a couple of the items here under connection, for example. Do I feel like I belong in my role, on my team, in my organization? Why or why not? What about the culture of my organization? Do I resonate with? Where's the disconnect? So it's really evaluating kind of your stance with each one of these, and then how to boost some of those different keys in each of.
Yeah, the first intervention has to be to understand engagement, because that's the number one thing that I hope comes out of that, is that for the most part, people don't understand engagement. Here, this book is a way to understand engagement. Once you understand it, then you can start saying, oh, okay, because there's no one-size-fits-all. This is not a panacea. But what it can do is it can give you a better idea to recognize. It gives you the vocabulary to speak with your employees so that you can see where you can improve.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks, Tracy and Darrell, as well. That concludes our webinar for today. There were some other questions that came through, and we'll try to address those via email. I will be posting, hopefully, a good recording of this webinar for you to refer back to, as well as sending you an email with other content information from this webinar. We appreciate everyone for joining. Look forward to our next webinars, and we hope to see you sometime soon. Thank you.